Autoridades presentes, senhoras e senhores, bom dia. Sejam bem-vindos ao
Ladies and
terceiro
gentlemen,
dia
good
da
morning.
primeira semana
Welcome to the
orçamentária
third day
deste
of the
ano,
first budget
promovida em
week
conjunto
of
pela Secretaria
the Federal Court of Accounts, conducted by the Governmental Macroeconomic Governmental Secretariat. The first budget week intends to foster the dialogue among specialists with the intention to update, improve, and produce knowledge regarding scientific knowledge in the scope of the public administration to ensure the good working of the session. You should use your microphones muted, only opening when you're going to speak. Your camera should be on for the participants to be able to see you. You'll have 15 minutes for your exposition, even using PowerPoint. After your talk, you will have 10 minutes for the debate and to comment the responses of the digital survey and the final remarks. The event is being transmitted by the official channel of TCU on YouTube. The audience can send questions on the chat, and your questions will be answered at the end of the debate. Today's program starts with panel number 3, in which we will debate Congress amendments and their impact on public budget. To participate in this panel, we have the Deputy Director of the Consultancy of Budget of the Lower House, Ricardo Volpe, the Deputy Secretary of the Federal Budget Secretariat, Márcio Luiz, the Consultant of the Budget of the Senate, Vinícius Leopoldino Amaral, the Special Secretary of the Presidency of the Republic, Bruno Grossi, and the ex-Secretary of Fiscal Affairs, Geraldo Julião Jr. As a moderator, we're going to have the Coordinator of Public Accounts of TCU, Tiago Alves de Gouveia Lins Dutra.
Bom dia a todos. Espero
Good morning.
que todos bem. Cumprimento inicialmente os nossos painelistas que estão aqui
Good morning to all the panelists present here. Márcio is the Deputy Secretary of the Federal Budget Secretariat, Vinícius, Consultant of the Senate Budget Secretariat, Bruno Grossi, Special Secretary of the Presidency, and soon we're going to have Ricardo Volpe, the Deputy Director of Consulting for Budget in the lower house. Thank you all for your presence here. We have a great representative of the technical areas of the budget, the public budget. I'm sure we're going to have a great day with a great panel, and we're going to have the opportunity to have reflections to improve the transparency and the credibility of the public budget. This is the main objective of the budget week, and I'm sure that we're going to have wonderful presentations and an excellent debate. Also, I'd like to greet the representatives of technical units of TCU, of the offices of the justices of TCU. They are present in a virtual roundtable, also a special presence of our audience, not only the people on the internet, but also the people in the virtual roundtable will be able to answer the survey using Mentimeter in the Teams and also on YouTube. Your participation is really key for us to have an interaction with the panelists. At the end of the presentations, we're going to show the results of the survey on screen. And I already thank you all for your presence and for the participation in the survey in the panel. Well, let's start. Today's topic is Congress amendments. It's a really hot topic of the moment. We always talk about this topic. And in the first 2 days of our budget week, we talked about the credibility of the budget and also the budget as an instrument of transparency. And in both days, we talked about the amendments. So it's a very relevant point in the discussion of the public budget. So today, we're going to speak more deeply about this topic. We have the budget, the public budget, as an instrument of public participation, and the political choices are done through this instrument. And the Congress people should reflect the interests of the electors. And these Congress people represent thousands or even millions of electors. So it's important to remember of the relevance of their role as a politician and the way that the Congress people use the public budget. Of course, it depends on the public system that is working in the moment, if it's parliamentary or presidential, and other decisions that have impact on the decisions of the Congress people by the electoral arrangement. In Brazil, we have a very fragmented public system, political system, and it is reflected on how the Congress people work by using the amendments. Although we have the political use of amendments, but it also has an impact in the macroeconomic decisions, and we need to have credibility to preserve constitutional principles and democracy. This is why it has a technical character, and this is our debate on these technical issues regarding the public budget. From the proposals of the legislative and executive branches, it's possible to choose amendments that try to balance the social and political interests. That way, the proposal to debate the Congress amendments is because this allocation mechanism has grown in the past years from the constitutional legal regulations and by the use of amendments of political groups having the reach of dozens of billions of reais. If all amendments were done to a ministry, we would have the 7th biggest ministry of the Explanados Ministérios. It would be only behind the citizenship, economy, and health ministry. It is a high value. If we look compared to the primary expenses, it's less than 2%, but they don't have decision margin. The obligatory participation is most part of the budget, and we analyze it, how the discretionary expenses are done. We observe that the amendments have gained great relevance, and we have to discuss how this level of Congress amendments can affect the governance of the budget. It means that the increase in the allocation of resources in the amendments has to do with the adaptation of public policies that are in the initial proposals of the budget project. The executive power has to adjust the use of the amendments. Regarding control, TCU has to adapt as well. Part of the resources are done locally in the electoral basis of the congressman. And without talking about the merit of the model, it provides the use of these resources in retail. To localize these resources that are decentralized, the Federal Court of Accounts has used technology, but it's a high cost to guarantee that legal funds are really allocated well. We have also a cost of opportunity of making a great effort to locate 2% of the primary resources, and 98% can be badly allocated. So we have a challenge to do the control. We have used technology to trace the accounting and financial work, and also the monitoring for construction works, but it is limited. It's only one layer of the control. We have to go deeper. And this decentralized budget, it has a high cost, and we have to understand the cost benefit of this control, trying to find a governance model to equate this relationship between cost and benefit. In line with this information, the challenge is to think of the budget governance. When there is a crisis, it is also an opportunity and a challenge for the budget governance to balance the authority and responsibility for the management of public resources, financial resources. If you have the autonomy, you also need to have the authority to control. We have the defense lines. We need to structure these defense lines. They today work in an integrated way. So we have to take all of this into account. After a few provocations, I just wanted to contextualize the topic of our panel. So it's basically just a few initial words from our perspective of control of the Federal Court of Accounts. Now I will hand the floor to each of the speakers, and as the Master of Ceremony mentioned, it's 15 minutes for each. So we're going to have also a debate after the presentations. Just to manage the time well and to have a good debate until 11:30, I'm going to let the speakers know when they have 5 minutes left to finish. So I apologize in advance for interrupting you to tell you about the time. So following this proposal of our program, we're going to start with Márcio Luiz Albuquerque Oliveira. He's a Deputy Secretary of the Federal Budget Secretariat. So Márcio, the floor is yours. Thank you, Tiago. Good morning to you all, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank you for the invitation. This week has been really useful, fruitful. The discussions that we've had here until now are important for us to discuss the role of the budget, the public budget. I'd like to greet my colleagues who are here in the panel with me, Vinicius, Bruno, Geraldo, Julião, also Ricardo Volpe. He has just arrived, and I hope we're going to have a very pleasant and fruitful morning. I'm going to show you a brief presentation that will follow our reasoning. And I ask you, Tiago, can you already see the presentation? Great. The panel is referring to amendments, Congress amendments. So I'd like to think of the discussion of the imposing of the public budget and to bring the amendments as a background picture of this imposition. I'm going to show you the recent modification that we had in the Constitution for the constitutional or Congress amendment, the Article 160, the Congress Amendments 100 and 102. We have worked very frequently with them, effectively with all the new rules, but it's clear for us that the discussion regarding the execution of the public budget is already done, is already solved. So we have this calling along with the society regarding the fulfillment of the budget and having a very clear proposal for the deliverables of goods and services. Of course, this calling also has to respect some situations that we live during the execution of the budget. thinking of the managers that are the fiscal managers that are responsible to that. So we need to look at this duty of execution without leaving behind some constitutional devices such as the spending limit and the fiscal legal instruments, and also the opening of credit. That now, also I'd like to make it clear that the imposition has a character that if there's any kind of impediment of technical order and they are justified in the execution, it can be suspended in that moment, and also a justification of non-execution of it, and it's exclusively applied for discretionary and primary execution. So it is basically what this amendment is about. And within this perspective, I went to the source of Justice Weather Oliveira. In his book regarding the fiscal rules, he talks about the imposition. More imposition or less imposition, depending on the structure or how you're going to treat these rules. Well, first, if I have more imposition, it is because the financial budget core authorizes, as soon as the budget is approved, it authorizes the execution of it, and to us, well, if you have less imposition in this context of the duty of executing, the imposing measures establishes rules for this execution. So it will immediately work on this action. So we are trying to find the middle ground on it. Not very impositive and not very little impositive. Another point of the more impositive variation is when the executive branch suspends the execution, even if it's temporary, and cancel the programming if it's not executed. So it is all part of the Parliament decision. In the last impositive, it shows that it keeps the initial provision for the canceling of the execution. And lastly, it's a very impositive variant, which brings the authorization for the executive branch against loans to do the approval that was approved in the budget law. And some countries use that, which is less impositive variant, is if you have any revenue frustration, you suspend the execution, and the protective power delegated by the executive branch through the legislative branch will suspend the execution of the budget. So it is just for us to have an idea of where we are. We gravitate between the more positive and less impositive. And when Justice Weather wrote this in 2003, he had no idea of what would happen later. So it is part of what is in the configuration of our agenda. So depending on the situation, we are more impositive or less impositive, depending on the annual approval of rules within the law. In that context, I would like to bring the focus that we have today of goods and services to the society. How do I see that in public budget? How can I understand that in the budget? We understand today, looking at the statistics of the budget that I got from the Congress, we see that are exaggerated levels of details of the budget, and they become redundant in terms of approvals of the budgetary law, which is studied by the Congress in over 17,000 lines. So today we have the Congress analyze 17,000 lines to approve the budget. So, in this detailing, many times, it brings a technicism that is not interesting for the society to know what is written there to be approved. But in our understanding, sometimes it only jeopardizes or disturbs the process. When you have this degree of an analytic budget that we have today, I don't defend that it should not be detailed in the execution. Of course, we need to have, as Tiago mentioned in the beginning, we need to have the traceability in the execution. What I'm saying is that we should reflect on these 13 levels of detail in the budget law, and they are connected, and of these 17,000 lines, there is even more when we include the appreciation of after the appropriation bill. In some way, it weakens what is in Article 10 of the budget law. So it's not that we wouldn't have the levels of details in the execution. What I mean is that the exaggerated detailing or an analytic budget can bring redundancy and changes in the budget that can be high, and difficulty in communication with the society in terms of deliverable of goods and services, and the use of some budget classifiers that are in the line of budget technical area used by the parliament. So we've had some situations recently using some classifiers and putting the classifiers in an execution or in a future proposal of legislation, and these classifiers were not appropriate. They were not created for that. So it is something that we need to pay attention. It's a side effect, a bad side effect to transparency and to the society as a whole, as it weakens this vision for us to have the effective deliverable of goods and services to the society with a degree of specification that brings in an analytic budget. Also, I brought some reflections since we are talking about amendments. These reflections, they bring the imposition and also the Congress amendments that we receive on our budget. The first item here, and the Justice brings to us, he says that the discussion on the impositive budget happens when there are corruption scandals. So when we had the situation of the mafia of ambulances and the dwarfs, the so-called dwarfs of the budget, and we remember also the individual amendments that can be identified in the budget from 2014 on in an effective way in the Constitutional Charter, when the executive branch decided not to execute the amendments in a negative environment, parliamentary environment. So it was discussed in 2015, and it brought more imposition to the budget. On the other hand, we see that the political cooptation, the allocation inefficiency, and the budget corruption not always can be resolved by the implementation of imposition in the budget. So we need to think of new other mechanisms in that sense. And other authors such as Miller, Pereira, and Amis say that the contingency of the budget creates an arena of negotiation between legislative and executive branches that result in exchange of support in the Congress. And it is also a concerning environment, so we need to take this into account as well. And other studies talk about the efficiency of these extra resources that are received, especially by the municipalities. And they say that the efficiency starts to be dissipated in time in case there is a frequency in the receiving of certain amendments to a specific cities, specific locations. Marcel, you have 3 minutes. Okay, here I have an evolution of the amendments so we can understand how they are distributed in the discretionary expenses, and it's clear the evolution of the part of these amendments in the discretionary budget. In 2015 it was 5%, and now 2021 we have 30% of the Congress amendments. In the past 2 years, thinking of the positive after the advent of the rapporteur amendment and the positive budget, in 2020 and 21 there was per se migration from the amendments that were the funds that were invested, and the advent of the amendments. And in 2020 and 2021, this value was reduced. We have a bigger reduction in 2021 in comparison to the previous year, and we saw more funds destined to the rapporteur amendments. This is just for us to have an idea that the percentage of these amendments to the normal programming that are in the appropriation bill, it's half of the normal programming. In 2020 it was half, and 2021 it was 42%. So we see that we have authorized discretionary budget, and we see that now the dynamics of the discretionary programming. Just to give an idea, only for discretionary expenses, we operated 3,625 requests for budget, discretionary budgets. Of course, there were some extraordinary expenses because of the pandemic, but I'm talking about the amendments alone. For individual amendments, we had over 2,000 requests. So in some way we have an execution that is linked to the appreciation and authorization from the Parliament, and it's really concerning to us, this connection, this linking between Parliament and executive branch during the phase of execution of the budget. Lastly, we are talking about that within a dynamic that we are showing as 6-7% of the expenses, and we know that there are mandatory expenses that make it more difficult for the Parliament to work in terms of budget. And just to finish, trying to bring some reflections so we can discuss until the end of this panel. Treating the imposition of the budget without discussing the tightening of the current budget, thinking of the disindexation, disobligation, we can think of the nulling of the effects, the expected results. If we do that, we think of a different definition of the allocation of public resources. And so to me, it is a situation that we need to pay attention to. And there is a dichotomy to be overcome. There is an excessive detailing of the budget law. It can bring technicisms, and the vision that we need to have the results for the budget, which is the deliverable of goods and services to the society. Therefore, the attributions of the legislative and executive branches have to be anchored in diffuse and collective rights, in detriment of disvirtuing the competence of the union, and we confuse it You confuse the competences of the federal government with the competences of the state and municipality governments. Thinking of the common competences that we have, we know that, but you have the example of some national policies such as Social Security, and there's no doubt that we're going to have the occurrence of the tragedy of the failure of the common obligations. So if each one looks only at their own side, you will see that there is a lose-win, and we will not be able to bring effectiveness to the budget which we dream of. I'm sorry I used 2 minutes more than I should. I'm sorry for that, but I'm here available for any question from the audience.
Thank you, Masu. Excellent presentation. I have a lot of comments here, but so that we can make good use of our time, I'm going to open the floor to our second speaker, Vinicius Lepogino Amaral, consultant in the budget consultancy of the Federal Senate. You have the floor.
Muito obrigado, Thiago. Bom dia. Eu gostaria de começar saudando a mesa, nossos colegas.
Thank you so much, everyone, my colleagues. I would like to thank the TCU for carrying out this event, which is a historic event for the budget debate in Brazil. So this is a theme that has been growing in importance. A lot of people are highlighting the importance of our panel today. I see that there's a lot of people who are interested in going in depth into this theme, and I would like to theme my presentation trying to answer the following question. Why is it that we have the growth of these parliamentary amendments? What are the conditions that enabled and leveraged this increase in Congress amendments? Because there's something special. It was different than what we've seen so far. So I'd like to bring some reflections, and throughout this process I identified 4 factors that I believe that may help to explain these motivations. First, we have an almost intuitive factor that the National Congress has been seeking out to increase its deciding factor in the budget. First, we had the individual amendments in the 2014 budget guidelines law, and then the same behavior, the same treatment was extended to the state parliamentary group in 2016. And then this was constitutionalized by amendment number 100. And then more recently, we had this change in the rapporteur's amendments with the creation of a specific code in the budget, which is the famous RP9, the primary result number 9, and also specific rules that are associated to this kind of amendment appropriation. So if you go back in time, you can see that this growth in the amendment, rapporteur's amendments, doesn't start with this markup. Actually, if we look at 2018, so 2 years before the explicit creation of this marker in the budget, we already had the first big movement in the growth of these amendments. They went to around 9 billion reais on that year, and they started to have a larger participation from parliamentarians in the very execution of these Congress amendment appropriations. And something else which is important that has also collaborated to this growth of this participation of Congress was the perception in the change of the discourse of the executive itself. And I would like to remind you all of an event that I think was important, and it was a very significant moment for a lot of parliamentarians, which was the participation of Paulo Guedes in the budget bill of Paulo Guedes, the Minister of the Economy, as well as the CMO meeting, the Budget Commission meeting, he saw that the minister said that Congress was the most able to define the use of the budget more than the very minister. So a lot of parliamentarians saw this as a green light for Congress to actually effectuate more decisive power, more deciding power for the allocations of budget appropriations. So they have these specific rules in the RP9 which protect these programs from any unilateral changes from the executive throughout the execution of the budget. The second factor, which I think is important to explain, is that apparently the current government has a different relation to the budget than previous governments. It seems like the political proposal of the current government goes less through the budget. It depends less on the budget than previous governments. This is very clear when we look at the behavior of certain authorities of ministries which usually demand a lot from for a large budget. Let's take a look at the Ministry of the Education, whose ministers try to lead great initiatives of expansion of their budgets, expanding offer of basic education or expanding the offer for superior education. The current minister, however, considers that the resources for education are already enough, that I don't need any more resources for education. Up to yesterday, he declared that Brazil has over too many universities. Another example, the Minister of Infrastructure. The Minister of Infrastructure gives a lot more emphasis to the issue of concessions to the private initiative than having direct construction works on the ministry, in contrast to other ministers in this same ministry. So the executive government itself has less pressure on the budget than in previous moments, which also, in reducing the demands of the executive for new expenditures, this reduces budget expenditures as a whole. And so the executive sort of draws back and allows Congress to increase its space in its decision in allocation of budget appropriations. So we need to look at the very strategy that the current government chose to relate to the National Congress. It's well known that the current government has refused to establish a stable party coalition in Congress. Ever since the campaign, this was announced that the government wouldn't seek this kind of alliance. So in a certain way, the government avoided adopting this, which is one of the pillars of the Brazilian coalition of parties, which is you make a coalition, an alliance in Congress, you establish a division of power, which is the division of ministries and division of the budget. So what happens? Up to this point, this coalition was not structured in a solid manner through parties. What happens more recently is that there was a certain kind of privatization, so to speak, of the leadership of the government with leaderships in Congress. The very president of the lower house, Arthur Lira, and the president of the upper house, Ciro Nogueira, it's like the representatives of the government in Congress. And what instruments do they receive to manage this coalition? They receive a power over these parliamentary amendments. So the government gives these leaderships enough power to obtain approval for their proposals in Congress. So this is a central aspect. So we had these imposing amendments for the state groups before, and now we have this movement from the imposing amendments. It was an isonomic proposal at that point. So the parliamentarians would have the same amount of decision over these amendments. And these new amendments have another characteristic because they allow them to discriminate. So a certain group will have the power to decide where they should be applied. So this can discriminate between who supports and who doesn't support the governments, therefore awarding or punishing parliamentarians according to their interest. But we can ask, well, does this use of the amendments, isn't that the classic amendment that has been shown ever since the government of Fernando Henrique? Why has this use grown in opposition to the past? So there's a difference in the coalition. Other governments that established a stable coalition, the coalition, unlike what might seem, the stable party coalition, they reduce the costs of negotiation with Congress. So when you don't have the stable coalition, then negotiations need to be done in a fragmented manner, oftentimes project by project. This increases the transaction costs and also demands a new cost, more costs in the end in parliamentary amendments. So instead of reducing costs, it ended up increasing this cost in negotiating with Congress. The fourth point, which I like to highlight, is the government's legislative agenda. They have a very ambitious legislative agenda with deep changes in the Constitution and in other legal aspects of the country. Not only are they big changes, but they're oftentimes unpopular changes. So they are changes that create a political problem for those parliamentarians who decide to support it. So the government seeks to manage its base, and so people want to know who the rapporteur is going to be, who's going to be presenting amendments, who's going to be the author of the project. In the case of these unpopular projects, it doesn't matter if the project is good or bad. Sometimes good projects can lack popularity as well. Obviously, this increases the counterpart, or the payment, so to speak, that the government needs to offer to parliamentarians, because parliamentarians will have a political problem in supporting these projects. And the government oftentimes does not defend the agenda that they themselves propose in Congress. So it's the parliamentarians that are aligned with the government that have the role of actually supporting these proposed reforms that the government has proposed. And this also increases the payment, the counterpart that Congress members end up requiring from the federal government. So all of these factors, so the desire for Congress to increase its participation in the budget, this relative retraction of the executive in terms of its own budget plans, of its own budget project. So the use of these parliamentary amendments by the executive is a way to keep a parliamentary base for the government, but with more costs than in previous moments. And this ambitious legislative agenda, all of them together can help to explain this process of strengthening of these parliamentary Congress amendments. So it has to do with the legislative desires of the government and its political capacity of gathering a base in Congress. The amendments become the key element which ends up solving this equation, so to speak. And these Congress amendments have the space because the government retracts its own demands based on the posture of the ministers, which usually, historically, demand more resources, but right now they're retracting their resource demands in relation to the past. So, finally, I'd like to make 3 observations on this scenario. First, I'd like to say that there are legal limits for the use of parliamentary amendments as a way to manage this coalition. The LDO, the Budget Guidelines Law, bans using the budget as a way to... This is a way to... It bans using the budget to influence parliamentary decisions. I don't see any significant changes in the short range because none of these 4 factors seem like they have any trend of changing. And I would like to finally point out that it's important for us to see that the instruments which are being used, such as these RP9s, these rapporteur's amendments, because RP9 are a part of the rapporteur's amendments, they are not the most relevant part. Everything that is being done with the use of this instrument can also be done without the use of this instrument. I'd like to reinforce this because in this panel and other panels over the last few days, there was a lot of discussion on maybe like the extinction of the RP9 would be the solution for the problems we have with the Congress amendments. 2 more minutes. All right, perfect. It seems to me like everything that is being done currently based on this marker can also be done without the RP9. It's more of an agreement in the political sphere rather than a legal imposition. Actually, there's no rule that gives an authorization for the general rapporteur to indicate. This was proposed by Congress, this was vetoed by the executive, and this veto was kept by Congress over the past 2 years. So it's not exactly that there's a legal power that allows the rapporteur and these Congress leaders have an influence in this execution. Actually, it's a political scenario that has been set up, I understand, because of these 4 factors that I mentioned, that makes it so that these amendments have got this characteristic. So it doesn't matter if the RP9 exists or not, the behavior will continue no matter what. These are my remarks. I would like to thank the TC once again and everyone who's watching. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Vinicius, for your speech. I also have a few comments, but I'm going to leave it to the end so that we have quicker dynamics so that we can reach the debate at the correct time. So now is the time for Ricardo Volpe, the Assistant Director for the Budget Consultancy in the Chamber of Deputies, the lower house of Congress. Thank you so much, Volpe, for coming along. I know your agenda is very busy. I'm very glad that you were able to come and talk to us. It's excellent to have your participation and your presence here with us. I'd just like to remind a few basic things. It's 15 minutes for your speech, and then we should have the debate starting at around 11:30. I'm going to apologize. When there's a few minutes left, I'm going to interrupt you just to let you know, just to help you in organizing your time. Thank you once again, and the floor is yours. Good morning, everyone. My good friends, Márcio, Bruno, Julião, Vinicius. It's a pleasure to be here in this TCU event. I'm going to try to keep the time as much as possible. First, I would like to bring a small panorama before the 1988 Constitution. Even though Congress had an effective participation in amendments in the Union, there was the social subventions that was the tool that was used in order to meet these parliamentary demands. After the 1988 Constitution, there was a prerogative for the parliamentarians to participate directly in the budget. At this first moment, the Congress resolutions did not establish limits, which ended up to having the Parliamentary Investigation Committee in relation to the so-called dwarves of the budget. And then after the report, he changed the resolution, he established limits and for amendments. They created individual and collective parliamentary amendments. So this whole political and economical scenario influences the greater or smaller intervention of Congress on the budget. In 2000, we had a budget reform, and Congress brought this resolution 1006, bringing new norms after the fiscal responsibility law. There was a fiscal crisis in 96, 97, which reflected in a certain way on the demand for the parliament to participate more in the budget. With the political and financial crisis of 2014, there was a great fight between the legislative and the executive that ended up leading to the impeachment. You have these imposing amendments that are instituted, and then Julião and Márcio were very close to this process, which ended up in the current amendment. And this all led to these alterations in which they have executions, they have a quota of amendments, and now, more recently, there's an identification of the rapporteur's amendments. The rapporteur's amendments have always been a part of the budget process in the legislative. All of the rapporteurs have around 2 to 5 billions, and there was a few changes in the scenario, but this will be dealt with in other speeches maybe. But this led to more intervention in the legislative in the budget. So these imposing allocation amendments have been using around 16 billion just in individual and collective parliamentary amendments. For instance, in 2022, it will be 10.5 billion for the individual amendments and 5.7 for the collective amendments. And we also have the money going to the financing of the campaign for the next year's elections. So 25 amendments for each congressman, value of 17.5 million. There's an allocation quota for each member of parliament in a very personal manner, in a way that they can use for the personal interests. And now we have RP7, 211 million for each parliamentary group. In the RP8, you have, this is inside any budget cuts and the appropriations. And there's not a specific quantity that was defined. It used to be a small list, and then it became big, and then lately the list has been growing quite a bit, as well as there is a limit. Individual amendments already have a pre-established limit. The similarity of an amendment of a commission and, let's say it's a national or generic amendment, and in the recent past this used to be done in each minister's group. They had a national quota, and they used to politically handle this. So in a certain way, this reserve always existed. A national quota to meet a series of translation apologizes, but we're having connection problems. So now Congress is managing these resources more directly here inside Congress, and taking away from the executive in this function. So these amendments, in 2020, there's an authorization of 36 billion. If you sum up the individual, which is around 16 billion, the so-called impositive amendments, and now the rapporteur's amendments, so we have a total of 36 billion. Out of these 36 billion, there's a share of that which is going to the special transfer, so-called special transfer. A part of the individual amendments go to special transfer, which in the year of 2020 was 2%. In 2021, out of these 33 billion, this went up to 6% in special transfers. And I believe that next year, up to 2022, there's going to be around 44 billion. 10% is going to go into these so-called special transfers. So for the 5 billion that are available, over 3 billions will probably go to special transfers. So they have direct money for the money of the municipality. So there's pressure for the group amendments to also be able to be used as special transfers. What does that mean? This is money straight in the account of a subnational entity. There's no technical evaluation, there's no criteria, you all know that. And so these 30 billions from Congress, between 33 and 34 billion, which is my projection for 2022, it consumes more than 30% of the so-called discretionary expenses of the executive. And this includes not only amendments, but also some resources. There's a minimum that must be used in health and education, for instance. So the executive power at this moment, they are really held hostage of this discretionary budget that's allocated by the legislation. There's smaller ministries that depend, all of their budget, discretionary budget must come from parliamentary amendments, and this effect reflects both in the performance and in the payment of expenditures. So the imposing individual budget, well, the payment is also around 7 to 9 billion reais just in individual amendments. The group amendments also have a very relevant value, around 10 billion reais, but effectively payment is getting to almost 15 billion reais. So this imposing budget, translation apologizes for the connection problems. So we already had rapporteur's amendments in the past. The execution was lower, more sporadic, but now in 2020, these rapporteur's amendments with the updated quote was 20 billion in 2021, 16 billions in 2019, got to 6 billion reais. And Congress saw that the rapporteur's amendments are being executed, so naturally, in the short run, it has to do with the political scenarios. So all of the budget, the budget process is influenced by the political and fiscal scenario. I have my restriction here due to my meetings that I was here. I wasn't able to organize in the Chamber of Deputies to be able to share my screen because I'm on my cell phone. I have my computer here, but I wouldn't have enough time because of my meetings. I want to show you certain things of how we can improve the management of these discretionary expenses, which include the parliamentary amendments. It's a way to try and, this is not a short term, it's important to conciliate political interests with the needs and priorities that must be reflected in the budget, in the budget guidelines law. The first point that we discussed quite a bit, Julian participated in this in our participation for Amendment Bill 72. So in each budget, there should be a prioritization. I'm going to put it just in investments to make it clear to everyone who's here. The prioritization of investments that are ongoing, for instance. So I think that the LDO, the Budget Guidelines Law, and this is something I mentioned to other parliamentarians, maybe next year in the election year, all of the money should be for construction works that are already ongoing. So 0 new constructions in the election year, because we have a lot of unfinished construction works. So the Budget Guidelines Law has today a constitutional power to define for investments, and this can be in 2022, they can just put zero investment in the LDO, the Budget Guidelines Law.
Another thing that we are going to publicize is the integrated registry of construction works in the federal government. This instrument is really key to subside the creation and execution of the budget. When you have information of the ongoing construction works to be part of the budget, this new construction work has elements to be fulfilled. If they have the environmental licensing, if it has a good project, so we can have a difficulty to find new investment that are not mature. And also to have a good management. For example, to say there is such and such money missing or left to end the construction work so and so. So it's important to have the clarity of what is under execution. I believe we need to invest in the improvement of this instrument. Another important thing, and also TCU discussed that, is to think of the public policies of the municipalities. Some municipalities they do not have certain public equipment, such as police stations. So the allocation of public resources from amendments or not, they must have criteria based on indicators of the municipalities. I have seen cases, for example, here in the state of Goiás, the request for the construction of sport courts from 2 Congress persons to build sports courts in the same municipalities, in a very small municipality. So it's important to understand the importance of criteria for the allocation of these amendments. We need to improve the proposal of the project, of course, to think of the criteria for approval with a better structured proposal. Since we started the impositive budget, we need to rethink of the norms that we have. We have had different meetings, I know that, but we have to think of technical accounting criteria and not personal criteria with the relationship with public policies and right criteria. So it's like providing a menu to the congressperson. What of this list is possible for your state? So it's a pre-approved list for this congressperson to choose how to allocate the resources, the financial resources. It's not like the mayor of my municipality asked for the money for this and that. No. Also, the same rules, the same criteria should be done for the rapporteur amendments. Established criteria to avoid being something very personal, very something that relates to the person's own choices. So in my presentation, I have some suggestions. So basically, this pluriannual vision of the budget, to think of indicators to improve the evaluation using correct criteria and reassess the process of selection of the allocation of the money from these amendments. It's hard, but we need to move towards these changes and fight for that. So It was great to listen to the discussions that we had prior to my presentation. I'll have to leave, but I'm sorry for that, but I'm happy to be among you. That's all right. Thank you so much for your presentation. The presentations, they keep complementing one another, and I understand you have a very tight budget, you have important matters to deal with, and we're going to be happy if you are able to participate on the debate. Great. Well, let's move on to Bruno Gross. He's a Special Secretary of the Presidency of the Republic. Bruno, thank you again for your participation, giving the importance to our event. So with no further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Thiago. I would like to thank again the Federal Court of Accounts for the invitation. I participated in the opening of the event with several important colleagues, and today we are specifically addressing the Congress amendments. It's funny that we didn't agree prior to the meeting on what we were going to talk about. Of course, we will reinforce certain points or repeat what somebody already said, but it's important to see the perspective of our colleagues. Marcio brought a conceptual explanation, and also Ricardo's vision, political vision of the process, in a very practical, Cartesian way to understand, a correct way to think of possible solutions. In line of these ideas, I prepared a brief presentation. I'm going to share it with you now to think of how we can provide some reflections on the Congress amendments. Can you all see my presentation? Great, excellent. Well, Ricardo Volpi did a historical retrospective of the situation. It was a very broad explanation. I will use this initial point as a moment after the Constitution, which is the decisions of the executive power in the budget, and they started to be used as in the character of law, the fiscal responsibility law, of the discussions that already existed between Congress and the other powers regarding the budget proposal. Now, using this timeline, starting from the year 2000, we had the contingency reserve in the budget guidelines law, thinking of how it would be done. Translation apologizes. We are not listening to the speaker. In 2004, the 2%, we had the reserve of 2%, and half of that was in primary law. Part of this value could be used by the National Congress as some kind of parliamentary amendment. So it was in 2003. So despite of the markers that were introduced from 2014 on, the individual amendments, they have always existed. They were all part of the discussion of the budget. With a bigger or smaller intensity, it existed. And Justice was right when he said that there was a bigger approximation with the Congress, and there was a closer look on the use of the budget and the amendments. In 2012, we had an important event created from the budget guidelines law. In that moment, we participated in different events in which the rapporteurs of the appropriation bill organized, and we understood it was important to have the popular initiative amendments We focused on the health ministry, and we had 2.2 billion reais allocated for health. But there was a small connection to the reality of who was going to execute this program. So in 2012, there was zero execution of the popular initiative amendments. We had the articulation among the two powers, the executive and legislative, and also remembering what Volpe mentioned, thinking of what the ministry can do, the institutions can do. If the program is from the executive branch or the legislative branch, but the ministries will execute the budget. So if the ministries cannot have technical materiality, if they cannot see that amendment or the executive programming has a technical execution, they will not do the execution, and they may be accountable, they can be held accountable for that. They can be held accountable for that, and it's important to see what are the capacities for each ministry and what they can execute. In the amendment of 2015, Amendment 86, we had 1.2%. That would be like half of the funds for health. We had tried these options in the healthcare after some changes. What we observe is that more than choosing a minimum or maximum value, it makes more sense for the amendments have a direct relationship of what has to be delivered. When you determine a percentage, it helps the division, the predictability, but it doesn't mean that it will bring ultimately a better service or a better construction work to be available for the population. In 2015, we started the amendments for the political groups, and it follows the same path. We see it in the budget guidelines law, see if it works, and then this matter becomes constitutional. Unfortunately, in Brazil, we have seen in the first day of this event the constitutionalization of the budget matter, but we were not aware to understand that we needed to review the 1964 law. We did not advance in this point. We didn't reach the end of the discussion, although this project had been in the Congress discussions for a long time. We just constitutionalized the different matters. We chose to change the constitution in several aspects, and it generates a huge complexity rather than changing or reviewing the finance law, as Marco mentioned. That would be more reasonable. In the Constitutional Law 100, these political groups amendments is taken to 1%. The 105 amendment in 2019, and I say unfortunately because it's not really a positive point to create the special amendments or special transfers. It's a mechanism that was questioned in the Supreme Court. There were different arguments in the Supreme Court about that, and it does not contribute to transparency, in my opinion, to specify what is the service that is being available. There is just a transfer of financial resources to states and municipalities, and ultimately it reinforces the account of these entities, which may not be linked to public policies. In 2020, we had the budget guidelines law with the amendments to the rapporteur, providing values to specific decisions. And in some situations, they were quite complex because they made reductions in mandatory decisions to the amendments. And it brings a big complication. This graph is just to show you the positive and negative aspects. We imagine that in the first moment, the creation of the amendments would take space of the discretionary schedule of the executive branch. So it could have an immediate substitution effect. This substitution effect happens, obviously, with the effective constitutionalization, and it becomes stronger in 2020 because of the rapporteur amendments and also in 2021. But we have a bigger problem, which is the excessive growth of the mandatory expenses. It's not the parliamentary amendments take or do not take or substitute the schedule of the executive branch, and it has happened a lot in 2000 and 2021. But all of them are being squeezed by the excessive growth of mandatory expenses. And the amendments also are part of this group. So there is decrease of the discretionary expenses, and we see the competition to an amount of funds that becomes bigger and bigger each year. In this point here, looking specifically to the parliamentary amendments included in the executive power, in the first year of the individual amendments, there were some specific amendments for electoral justice, but most of them were for the institutions of the executive power. So from bottom up, the blue one is agriculture and then education. On the side we have healthcare, citizenship, regional development. The green one is tourism, and up there the other institutions. So the concern has always been to guarantee the allocation of funds in healthcare. So the existence of a minimum percent and the amendments of political groups as a practice, and now in 2021 it is authorized in the budget guidelines law, and there is a substantial increase in the executive institutions having funds not allocated in the institutions that execute the public policies, and the regional allocations due to the rapporteur amendments. When you have the effect of the amendments and of special transfers and the rapporteur amendments, you see a considerable difference in the percent. I'm summing everything up here. So in 2020, health had 33%, and in 2021, 45%. We see there is not a respect on the individual amendments, but the percentage of health decreased a little. But it is interesting to observe on the aspect of the possible imagination of the continuity of schedules. Looking at the period between 2014 and 21, and we have to make some considerations on the analysis. There had been changes in the mandates of the Congress people, but even looking at 1 year, from 1 year to another, there are very few cases in which you guarantee a continuity in the same programming, the same schedule of individual amendments from 1 year to another. So we see that they are specific interventions for a certain mandate, but very punctual, very specific interventions that do not have the tendency to be repeated from 1 year to another. if we can see these studies in different ways. Bruno, you have 2 minutes. All right, thank you. You can see a small percentage for discontinuity in what was expected in the creation of political group amendments. In 2021, only 2 of them guaranteed this continuity among 833 schedules in the budget law. So we had changes of new political groups, of new mandates, but we can see that the structuring works that had resources that came from the political group amendments, we did not see the guarantee of the continuity, which reinforces the need to improve our demands, the systematic of demands of the continuities. And going ahead, I only show you a comparison of the we can see that in the situations, in the deficiencies in the specifications of the schedules, the amendments could bring some explanation of the accrued liabilities, and something that happened in the spending limits to reduce it, but it did not happen. We had substantial growth of the accrued liabilities in this period, maybe because of the spending limit. But what concerns us is that in the general parliamentary or Congress amendments, I'm talking about all of the amendments, all of the types of amendments, there was a growth when you compare the amount of accrued liabilities with the ordinary budget of that year done by the Congress. So if you compare one year to another, there was an increase in the volume of accrued liabilities, but we can see this movement. It follows a little the trajectory of the executive branch, but in a bigger way, in a bigger amount. It is interesting because I'm not talking about extraordinary credits. I removed it, so there's no factor for 2021 due to the situation of the pandemic. So I tried to show you, gentlemen, some pieces of data to share for us to discuss, thinking that we have a conflict of amendments. The evolution is shown like that, and some problems that we need to equate. One of them have to do with transparency, especially in the points regarding the special transferring and the continuity of the Congress amendments, which is a point of attention to all of us. Thank you, Thiago. Thank you, Court of Accounts, again.
I'd like to thank you, Bruno. You have an excellent presentation. Like you said, we didn't really organize all of this, but all the presentations are really complementing each other, aren't they? Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you so much, Bruno. As you said, we didn't really organize this, but even then, the presentations really complement each other. And now Julien has the challenge. He is a great partner of the court. He's the ex-consultant secretary of fiscal matters, and he's a retired budget analyst. So let's talk about this issue of imposition. So Geraldo Julião Jr., the ex-adjunct secretary of fiscal matters at the SOF. I open the floor. Thank you so much, Thiago. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the Court of Accounts for the opportunity of participating in this seminar, and also to thank and demonstrate my happiness in participating in a panel with a lot of my ex-work colleagues in the legislative. But I was from the executive, they from the legislative, but we are always very closely in contact. And in the same manner, I'd like to remember that the TCU is getting back something that the Budget Secretariat tried to do in the past, which is the national budget seminars, and this initiative is very welcome. I think it would be very important for this to be perpetuated in the future. Just like a few people said, being the last one to present is very hard, since we didn't really organize who was going to talk about what, and given my current condition, I wanted to be a little bit more provocative. So I'm going to, I think all of you here, there's certain things that I disagree with and others that I agree with, but as a whole, I would like to take everyone's words and make them my own. But I want to make some general discussions. You, Thiago, in your presentation, you started talking about the steam budget. By the very definition, it comes up as a struggle between the absolute power of the sovereign and the society's power. So it is the reclamation of collective will against the will of the sovereign. And this is what the budget is, and this is why it's the very root of democracy in the Western world. Taxation and expenditures, they go from the sovereign to the legislative. Is this positive or negative? It's an open question. So what is the problem for the Congress to impose expenditures to the executive? What is the problem, in my view, in Brazil? And we need to take a look at the particularities. Given the set of rules for the development of the budget, all of them have been approved by Congress itself. I'm going to mention a few, but without trying to be an exhaustive list. The regulation of revenue, the minimum constitutional expenditures, most of them were born in Congress itself, minimum values for different powers or for specific public policies like Fontaine and others, the creation and the growth of compulsory expenditures, and the spending limit. What happens with this set of rules? We get to a situation in which the volume of amendments become a real problem for the execution of the budget from the executive power. So we can get to situations in which we just can't solve the calculation. It's going to be something wrong in the books. And so the powers need to fulfill all these rules, and then certain expenditures are imposed to the executive. This can lead to the following situation. Either the executive doesn't follow the fiscal rules that are imposed by the legislative, or the executive will stop policies and stop providing public services that they now do. So this contradiction is at the very heart of the biggest problem in relation to this. So is the problem the size of the amendments? Once again, I'm going to say that's not the problem in my point of view. In my understanding, the value is a problem in the contract, but that's not the main issue. So what is the main issue? Are the amendments a problem in and of themselves, or are they a symptom of a larger dysfunctionality in government? Is it a fever, or is it a disease, as we used to say? In my point of view, the biggest problem is thinking of the problem. The executive and the legislative, are they cooperating, or are they in conflict in the determination of public expenditures? I think that's from my point of view, of course. This is my individual opinion, of course. The problem is that the Brazilian political system, the coalition presidential style, presents growing dysfunctionality over time. And what are these dysfunctionalities? The non-generation of governability. You don't have stability in the presidential mandate, and a full functioning of the institution. The system itself leads to this. You have an incentive to an excessive fragmentation between parties. Here, we have 24 parties with representation in the lower house and 16 in the Senate. None of them have most of them are very similar. They don't have programs, individual programs or ideologies. You can look at these similarities when you get a matter like the printed vote law. You can look at party by party. It's really scary because you see that there's no difference. Each party people voted for and against in each party. So this system makes it very hard to solve and forward main problems of society, because our main issues in Brazilian society, they are typical of the late 19th and early 20th century. Basic sanitation, basic urban areas, basic land tenure conflict, education. Think that lots of countries solved from the 19th to the 20th century. No, we're still struggling with that. And this coalition presidency system, the way it exists today, it depends, or they used to depend. I don't know if this is still a fact. I'm a little bit in a doubt of this. It really depended on the capacity of the leadership of the president. So you had crises when the president was unable to demonstrate leadership, and you had moments of stability when the president exercise stronger leadership. I don't know that after the crisis that we lived, if this is still true or not. Another thing that's very interesting and that I started to do but I still haven't finished is that you can take our institutional system and see that as mutant. I can't approve it's easier to approve an amendment than a law. From 2014 to now, up to March of 2021, we had 33 constitutional amendments that were approved. I stopped in March 2021. Out of these, 19 of them dealt with fiscal and budget areas, 60% of them. So, our system is completely mutant. It's unstable. It does not create a situation of foreseeability and stability. So, if you take all of these issues and put them together with the growing of mass society that comes from the middle of the 20th century, and currently we have new communication mechanisms such as social media, if we get all of that together with a growing crisis of representativeness in Western democracies. When I joined this public service in 1986, there were certain cardinals in Congress, so to speak. There were people who you talk to and things happened after you talk to them. That's not the case anymore. So, is this a problem for today? Is this a problem of a context? I don't think so. Because from the period from 1945 to 1964, you can classify it in a bunch of ways, but it wasn't stable. You had the suicide of Getúlio Vargas. You had a lot of different coups and counter coups. You had the coup against Lott. You had a variety of different military problems in the government of Juscelino Kubitschek, and then Jango renounced. Can you imagine if all of this happened with WhatsApp? It would be completely different. You had parliamentary implosions. You had the Goulart government. You can call it anything, but not a stable government. So in truth, this issue of institutional instability in Brazil from coalition presidencies, well, this is really a part of our institutional framework, and we can't overcome this. We haven't been able to so far. So what really characterizes our current context is the existence of a very weak presidential leadership, which is not anything new in Brazil. Dilma government had the same problem. And this weakness of the presidential figure, of the leadership of the president, brings an advancement of Congress on the budget. In my point of view, this is not a classic advance in the sense that you have Congress imposing certain policies to government. They do this when they establish compulsory minimum expenditures. It's a bit of a paradox of a situation, because what we have is a balkanization of the budget. Each organized sector of the legislative appropriates themselves a certain slices of the budget, and they want to impose this to the whole executive. So it's a paradoxic situation in the sense that we approve a series of subjects that are not inside the existing fiscal rules. Both those that are proposed by the executive and those that are proposed by the legislation. So you have a lot of these pressures. A lot of them are very legitimate, in that the parliament's function is also to establish public expenditure. So what I think is going on is like if we had two or more budgets. We have the budget for the executive power that takes care of the state machine. You do this public policy, you need to spend X on health, X on education. The health system has to work. The FNDCC can't be messed around with. You need to follow all the legislation. The legislative doesn't care if the rules aren't possible to follow. So beyond all that, you must do all of the programs that Congress thinks that should be done. All of this respecting a series of fiscal rules. So this paradox is what brings us to an equation which we can't solve. And the last year's budget, or the early this year budget, we almost got to a state of breakage. So I don't think we should really just solve this with a law and a constitutional amendment. We need to look at the system as a whole. And also, all of these problems that were presented very well by Volpe and Vinicius and Bruno, you can notice that every time that the executive has a weak leadership or a weakened leadership, Congress gets more power. It's not by accident that the amendments grew with President Eduardo Cunha, and now impositions have grown in the Bolsonaro government. It's like the President of the Republic really hasn't understood how the budget works. And so this has created this situation, and he just lets them go. And so my point of view is based on Sergio Abrantes' thoughts. I think that we need to think, Brazilian society needs to think whether they have any pretense of advancing and overcoming the dilemmas that we live. Not only the context-based dilemmas, but all of these dearths of infrastructure and problems. I think we should have a reconstitutional assembly with very different rules so that we don't elect the same oligarchies that we've been electing since 1988. And it should be exclusive. It should have specific rules to create a new national pact so that we may think of Brazil in the future. This past week, the president from a financial institution, I think from Banco Itaú, 2 minutes? Okay. He said that the next government is a government of rebuilding and maybe national reconciliation. I like to paraphrase Tolstoy, who says in his book, Anna Karenina, that all happy families are the same. Unhappy families, each one has their own unhappiness. So what would I like to say? All societies with all of them that have solved their institutionals, they're all monotonously the same. The ones that have problems all have their varieties of problems. And so unfortunately, well, these societies that are stable have been diminishing, but it's not that fun in that society. So let's wallow in all our problems. I hope to contribute to the debate. It's a little bit more generic, but it's more of an abstract reflection on all the problems that we're facing. Thank you very much, and I'm available to participate in the conversations, including about imposing budgets. Thank you so much, Julian. You took back a few of these important points. I think that this is a topic that we can look at from a variety of point of views, from the political perspective, which is at the very essence and origin of the issue. But we can also look at the legal aspects. We can also look at the constitutionalization process, the budget guidelines law, and also the institutional issues, the managerial issues of the National Pact in budget allocation and public policies, and also the fiscal issue, which may have an impact as well. It also ends up being a point of contention. You seek out this budget space to try and fit the parliamentary amendments or Congress amendments. I want to see with people from the organization. Oh, okay. She's already sent us a message. I'm going to look at the partial results for our survey. After that, we'll start developing our debate based on this. So, well, the first issue here: are parliamentary amendments to the budget necessary for the effective legislative participation in the budget process? 21 disagreed and 12 agreed. Okay, next one. The definition of budget credits by members of Congress, does it strengthen the allocation function of the budget? Most people disagreed partially or totally. 19 disagreed and 12 agreed partially or totally, which also reflects a bit on the first question. Here we have a comment. I think parliamentary amendments have grown a lot in the last few years, considering that members of parliament know local priorities. Oh no, this is the question. Okay. These are some of the mentions on what are the main challenges for the implementation of Congress amendments. And here we have a lot of different comments. A good part of the actions indicated in parliamentary amendments don't have any connection to public policy thought by the planning institutions of the executive power. It should stop being electoral trading bargaining tool. It makes the execution of public policies that are priority public policies impossible. There's a lack of definition in the application of resources by each municipality. Political interest in liberation of resources in such a way as to enable the planning of the units that receive these amendments. Connection with public policies and with the real needs of the subnational entities. So I think that here we can take a few of these provocations. I think we still have a few more questions. Let's take a look. Maybe it'll be good. Well, I don't know if we're gonna close up all the questions and open up to debate, or should we start debating in the middle of it?
Well, let's see this question. Describe in a few words the impact of Congress amendments regarding the public budget. These are the most common responses from the users. This virtuing, corruption, so most of them have a very negative view on the amendments. Next one. Congress amendments, are they aligned with the goals of specific public policies? So Congress people, they just want to inaugurate public squares. They tend to be again different from the long-term purposes. The amendments are a dissociation on the planning of public policies. No, they're aligned with their own interests, the own interests of the politicians. So just reinforcing what they said previously. Let's see the next one. I think it's the last one that regards healthcare. The distribution of Congress amendments in the healthcare area must observe the objective criteria of the Article 17 of Complementary Law 141 of 2012, take into consideration the epidemiological density dimensions. Some people say yes, other people say there was no criteria. Yes, it is an attempt to include the amendments in minimum criteria. So here we can see a more positive reaction from the public. Now, describe in up to 2 words. Can you open the question again, please? I don't see it. No, here, the question now. Describing in up to 2 words the challenges in the special transference amendment 105, the location of the individual amendments, imposing amendments for the subnational entities. We see the word transparency very much, electoral impact, lack of communication, auction, prioritization. It contraries the good technical aspect. And here the last one, I think, in your opinion, the TCU and other federal institutions have to monitor the application of the special transferring coming from individual amendments. So almost everybody said yes, and a small group of people said no. All right, excellent. So we have a lot of material to discuss. So we can have a first round of 5 minutes to each of the participants, so we can comment the main perceptions of the audience regarding parliamentary amendments, and from the survey, the questions that were included in the survey. And from this first round, we can see the most interesting points for us to debate on. And maybe we can have, in a second round, a more flexible participation. So I will follow the same order of the presentations. So first, Marcio, tell me your opinion about the comments of the participants. Okay, Thiago. Well, the survey was very good. I congratulate the organization for it. It was really nice. We can reflect upon it. These questions in the survey, they concern us. We are in a different political system. We have different levels involving the process of discussion of the budget. And I am concerned with the disbelief of the population or the society who participated in this survey regarding this instrument, the amendment. The budget is very formal. It's not only formal for the discretionary expenses, but we should advance to have a budget with a material law that would treat the imposition of the mandatory expenses in a way that the budget law could have enough strength to bring the assessment of the policies, and then we could maybe make the choices of the population to be heard and met. I'd like to remind you all the concept of collectivity. The specialists of budget around the world, when they talk about outcomes from the budget, they calculate, for example, levels for you to motivate indicators, as Volpe mentioned, in a more aggregated way compared to what we have in our public budget. Bruno also mentioned that we had 19,000 items or lines. So imagine having indicators that point out to this. So it doesn't work. We do not reach our goals. So I think that the budget must have a material perspective, the analysis of the expenses, review the expenses. We should have the power to do that, but we don't. The budget does not have this power. Everything is already done the way it is, and we don't see a movement. The parliament doesn't want to change the, per se, the achievements. And the result is a very unequal society that depends on the budget. So the both polarities, both sides of this coin depend on the budget. People who are on the side of poverty, extreme poverty, and they really need this this budget. And on the other side, we have the lobby of the large companies that they need to keep their, they need to have their benefits and their privilege. So the budget should be a way to transform that. So we can do that by the constitutional framework that we have. So I'm really concerned with this belief of the people on the amendments. If we had another format in the budget, of course it depends on the law of finance, and maybe it's easier for us to change the constitution. Is it easier? Well, we have it, so let's follow it. The finance law will take a long time to be changed or updated. So we can try to summarize this degree of detailing in the different competences, and we don't want to mix them up as well. When people talk about the politician wanting to inaugurate a square, it's mixed up with real needs of that municipality. And the problem is the demographic census is the problem of the federation. So we need to reflect on this, on how the amendments can really serve to the collective service that we defend. Excellent, Marcio. Thank you. I think that regarding the effectiveness of the amendments within the public policies, I think it's a consensus that it is a big challenge for it to be effective, because there is an information asymmetry of the ones who are formulating and fostering the policies, and there's no doubt we need to improve this model without questioning the legality or anything like this, but we need to improve this. On the other hand, we have a big challenge concerning the political will. We need to have some instruments within budget to make some consensus to be feasible in order to guarantee that the collective interests will be stronger than individual interests. But the entity of the collective interests is weak. So the challenge is to have an evolution in the political system to create the conditions to have a budgetary system that will reach this goal, to make public policies feasible, which is necessary for our society. In a technical point of view, it's up to us, technicians, to find and propose alternatives. As Volpe mentioned, a very pragmatic vision to find manageable solutions that will think of the scenario, and also propose legal solutions for the improvement of the institutional legal arrangements to overcome the model that is able to have a balance between the social, economic, and economical interests. I think it's a point that we need to discuss, and I'm going to talk about this political perspective, something that is really commented by Vinicius. So I'd like to hear Vinicius' perception on the comments of the audience regarding the Congress amendments. Thank you, Thiago. It's clear that the audience have a negative view and a negative opinion on the amendments. Historically, there are many reasons for this negative perception to exist. The amendments, when they are on the news, it's because there's some kind of corruption involved. The investigation committee in the Congress that happened almost 30 years ago, showing political articulation involving the amendments. And now, yesterday, the TCU made decision regarding the procurement of the regional ministry with connotations that have to do with the repertoire amendments. So there's no doubt that there are many reasons for the audience to have a negative perception of this topic. I confess that we need to have more broader studies regarding the amendments. Of course, it's clear that there are problems, but how big are these problems? We're talking about thousands and thousands of amendments. So how many of these? What is the global behavior of these amendments? We need to have more studies on that. There are many problems, and the press shows that very clearly. But I think we need to have better studies or more studies on how these financial allocations are being done and the concrete benefits that is brought to these amendments. Because theoretically, if you make a political economy analysis, the study of the parliament is to analyze the electoral benefit that they have with these amendments, and to transform the amendments into electoral benefit. They need to provide benefit to the population. So it seems it's not really inefficient in this use. For example, the individual amendments, they have a certain amount to allocate. They want this amount, these funds to be converted into construction works and other things that will help the population. So theoretically, it seems that this money is well spent. So it's important for us to see the electoral incentive, which is not conflicting with the social interest. So the politicians want that money to be applied, and they want this to be converted into visibility to them. They want to be that person who helps that specific population of that city or state, and it will help them to be re-elected. So I don't see these interests to be conflicting. But is this really happening, or are there other interests prevailing in this case? So I confess that there are many questions around this topic, and it deserves much more attention. If this money is being used in favor of the population, or if these funds are being dissipated to other ends. So there are some questions some issues that are jeopardizing, some rules that they are jeopardizing. For example, the minimum amount for healthcare. So this minimum amount is not included in the rule to privilege the healthcare area to send amendments to this area. It was included because in this constitutional amendment there was an increase in the minimum amount of healthcare, and it was mentioned by the government that part of this raise should be negotiated by parliamentary amendments. So the idea started being bad. So you want impositive amendments, and you have to participate on that. And today, the imposing amendment is part of the healthcare public policy, and it shouldn't be like that. It makes it difficult for the implementation of healthcare services. And the congressmen, they don't like it either, because it is a restriction on the freedom of allocation that they have. And they say there is money, there's a surplus of money, and I don't have nothing to do with the health. Because if I build a health unit, the mayor cannot maintain this health unit. And I cannot include that, the salary for personnel, for example, in the amendment. So we can see that maybe the allocation of funds can be jeopardized because of the bad use of the amendments. So we need to have more global, more deeper studies on that, and from the studies we can suggest improvements. One of the improvements is when the ministries, they send handbooks to the Congress suggesting amendments. Most part of the amendments today are done by templates used by the executive branch, and the congressperson is fit in a programming of the ministry. So in that case, we can increase the synergies. Is it a question of conflict or cooperation? This is what we have to think about. We can create instruments and rules to maximize the collaboration among the powers, and it will reduce conflicts. Ultimately, the congressperson knows that if they allocate the money in a program that does not exist, the ministry will not be able to execute. It's going to be hard to do that. And at the end of the year, it will not be executed. And it's bad for this politician that will not have anything to show to their electors. So it's interesting to maximize this harmony, and it's a pathway that we need to follow.
Wonderful, Vinicius. You brought an important point. We must enable the political and electoral interest within the law with legitimacy, and we must have a solution, be it a new appropriation instrument or adjusting our instrument that we have with parliamentary amendments with criteria that may contribute to both objectives, with the goal of harmonizing with the public policies that are proposed by the executive government and giving an identity and authorship of resources to that parliamentarian so that they can show their action in favor of their constituency. It's not the ideal, but we must have some sort of advancement in the political system, and this goes way beyond our discussion here. But while we don't have that, we must seek out the best legal, institutional, managerial solutions, and Volpe brought a few of ideas of transparency, this idea of making a registry for projects. So I want to know Volpe's opinions on the things that were brought up by our survey. I'm gonna use a little bit of what Vinicius said. I think this issue of amendments that need to be better studied, but if we look at individual amendments, for instance, as a group, there's an issue on the pulverization of resources. Is there a public policy behind it? Because usually these individual amendments, the members of parliament put it in a more generic action in this or that state. They don't put in a specific amendment as a whole. So that's why I really defend the enhancement of this process of the indication of proposals for amendments so that we have a public policy behind. So an organization that allows for the amendments to go into a structured public policy. I'm also have a doubt whether these parliamentary resources, in the years that we look at it, if they execute things that the executive are avoiding. It can go to tourism, it can go to tractors. They just go and try to get whatever the executive can handle. It's not that independent from the posture of the executive or of each minister in each ministry. So this thing that we mentioned about collaboration and the way that this process happens, that's why I think I value a lot this idea of improving, because in the last, if we really look at it, maybe we had everything in back in the days. We used to make all in the executive's hands, but the parliamentarians went to the ministers and they asked, and the same thing happened and went to private interests. Whereas the parliamentary bench amendments or political group amendments, in my perception, a lot of these amendments, like when the PACI, the infrastructure project started going out and the PACI grew too much and the resources started pulverizing, these political group amendments have the potential that in discussion together with governors, they have a possibility of good execution. I have a study before the PAC that the political group amendments, they have a good amount of execution, and now recently they've also had a good amount of a good level of execution. Why? There was a conversation between governments and secretaries with the parliament and with the executive, so you can make it so that the executive will promote an important infrastructure work in their state. So you end up making things happen faster. So there's different constitutional conditions here. In the relation to the issue of corruption, it's important that if we look, this might be in the hands of a minister or in the Congress, but the process of corruption can happen either way if you don't have good governance in the public governance, if you don't have allocation criteria, if you don't have bidding processes, so on, and controls by the TCU and other institutions, so that these resources are not deviated from their use. So there was the issue of the parliamentarians buying tractors recently. That means we need parameters, we need criteria. So if you have criteria to prepare these ideas, you can evaluate whether this public resource was used correctly or was misused. I consider that currently we have a bunch of different systems like Comprasnet. These are payment and purchasing systems from the government. Well, I don't. And the Mais Brasil platform. Well, these are very rich systems. If any of you already had the opportunity to get to know that, we've had a few meetings on that. It has georeferencing. You can put in the equipment and say, okay, this equipment is here. They take a picture of the street. They compare this with Google Maps. They compare the pictures in the past with the pictures, current pictures. You can check on Google Maps whether, let's say, a street has been paved or a canal has been built. So you can actually see if that resource was applied. We have technologies in order to implement this checking. So this issue of corruption, I think that corruption can happen with parliamentary amendments or not. So the Congress amendments might have a little. So I think we should have the Congress amendments be a little more regulated, and that's the important part. Corruption can also happen without the amendments. Just to finish up, the issues of special transfers. Really, this was a process that was imposed by the legislative through a constitutional amendment. I really believe that this should be rethought, because the money goes straight to the state's account, the TCU loses its capacity to monitor these things. And in the Constitution, it says that the local Court of Accounts should monitor those resources. Why? Because you have a donation of the money. You donated the money, and that's that. If you have money on your account and you gave it to someone you know, now I'm going to monitor what you gave to someone. Well, unfortunately, if you have a donation, it's given, it's donated, you can't do anything. So there's no criteria, no parameters. So if we could take a step back in this sense, you must have criteria. Otherwise, you have very high risk. So there's a lack of transparency about what you're going to do with certain resources. Way in the future, you can study a series of resources that each municipality has, and they should exercise the control. In the pandemic now, I had certain works in which municipalities are getting more money from parliamentary amendments than they would collect from taxes. So they had an overflow of money. It was way more than if they didn't have the pandemic. So even the complementary law saying that they should make explicit what they do with federal resources, you don't have these explanations. If this person didn't have a control from the local Court of Accounts, all the money is mixed up. You have expenditures, you have tax collection, you have money from the federal government, and maybe they're going to say, oh, I applied this money on a certain end, but it's all their money, so the money is all mixed up. There's no more control. So this issue of special transfers, I think it's a very high risk. The money goes straight to the municipality very quickly. If the municipality has good governance and applies it well, maybe it would be better applied than if it was here in Congress and with a long process. So nothing guarantees that the management of the federal government is more efficient than the municipal governments. But if we look at the reality of most Brazilian municipalities, you must have a strong public policy behind with criteria in order for us to have actual results. And like Julian falou, we're still overcoming things from our last century, from the 20th century. So that's basically my point of view, complementing what the colleagues have already said. Thank you so much, Volpe. Well, first I'd like to give an alert here because Luciani has explained that the final text wasn't like that. The state courts of accounts are no longer the responsible for that area. But anyway, donated money, it's something that you can't monitor. You mentioned the 173 case, which is very curious, where they had an allocation of 60 billion, 10 billion for health, and the other 50 billion are allocated following GP and GPN criteria. And it's just like you said, it is sent and it ends up losing a lot of traceability. It gets very hard to identify these resources. And I always say, if you don't have controls over resources, the resources aren't yours. It's as simple as that. It doesn't matter if it's the manager's control, if it's the internal or external audit control. If we can't actually see where this resource went, well, it's not a federal resource. And that is the big challenge. We have a few gray areas that we need to deal with. And these cases that were mentioned here really are very important challenges so that we don't have, let's say, the opportunity for corruption and fraud. Fraud and corruption depend a lot on the will and the capacity and on the opportunity for those people who want to commit fraud or corruption. So the less opportunities you give, we will reduce the possibility of corruption. I thought this was very appropriate. And you also talked about the issue of transparency. We have certain tools. We're in a different reality, and maybe our big hope for increasing our political cohesion in the country, because today, despite having this history of politicians that, let's say, they always inaugurate construction works and they want to show their constituency that they're working for them, and they don't necessarily bring a vision of the national challenges. I think that's the big point. Members of parliament oftentimes have to deal with the big national challenges in relation to the federal government, but oftentimes they also need, for their political survival, they need to show their constituency that they're working for them. And we'll see that big national debates such as the Social Security reform, tributary reform, administrative reform, all the legal frameworks which are being analyzed today. The press is on top of it. We have NGOs on top of it. See who voted in favor and who voted against each one of these reforms. And in a certain way, this creates a certain kind of identity, not a political identity necessarily, but at least in relation to certain areas, and maybe in the future we might have a certain alignment, political alignment, which might improve our political and social cohesion in this sense. Well, I'm going to open the floor to Bruno. Bruno brought about a few very interesting points. I really like to talk, Bruno, about the need of updating for 2020. It was a particular advancement, but we're in a different scenario. We can't have this old legislation ruling. I think this will be a big opportunity of bringing certain legal, institutional solutions, managerial solutions to our budget process, and that it would dilute the scenario, and increase transparency. And it's transparency. We talk a lot about the level of detail in our budget, but that's just publicity. That's publishing everything. Marcio scared me. I was listening to your speech. You said there were 17,000 lines in the budget. That's impractical. That's just not practical. It goes beyond human capacity to process this amount of information, and obviously it does not communicate. The contact that I have with the budget law, even though I work in this area, I don't think it's easy to understand. The only document which might be more for transparency is the citizens' budget, which is a great initiative to improve. And we really need to advance in transparency, which might improve the design of budget transparency. I'm going to ask Bruno about his opinion on the things that we saw in the survey. I'm going to start with the new finance law and the importance that there is in trying to modify the structure of law 4220. So there's a multiplicity of amendment alterations and the complexity, and there's not enough time to get the laws to stabilize and see whether that works or not. You promote one after the other without having the correct notion that this would work in a certain way or not. Even the transformation of the budget into an imposing budget, we're still testing a few things. There's a perception of investment. On the LDO, we're testing all these things. Actually, they're the creation of new situations, new impositions, and we may be able to get to the end, and we might get more problems than benefits in the end. And what's curious about all this is that even though we used the LDO throughout all these years in relation to the law 4220, because a lot of the votes were established to say that that was no longer the legislation, time and time again we receive questions about concepts. Oh, did you change this or that's in the LDO? You don't have the capacity of doing this. And then you think, well, we can't go back to that discussion anymore. But unfortunately, these are real situations in other authorities questioning these points. So I don't think it's reasonable to continue in this way for anyone, really. Not for the executive, not for the legislative, and not for the accounts, Court of Accounts. This multiplicity of rules in the Constitution is not reasonable for anyone, so I think that we should try and make a certain reaction to this. Of course, the political moment is not easy. We won't be solving this in the short term. So another point that I'd like to bring up and that I mentioned in the first day is that our budget law is not a material law. Unfortunately, unlike other countries, the discussion of the budget and of decisions that are going to be talked about, they're going to be discussed in other legislation, not in the budget, and this brings the pressure to the budget. And it's like Julian said, well, we're going to reach a point where the situation is just completely impossible. We can't have 30 situations that are competing amongst each other constantly. So unfortunately, I don't think this is a situation that's desired by anyone, but it's what happened in this constitutional change, which had the spending limit. It ended up affecting health. The health system had just been hit with a recalculation of the total GDP that should be used, and so this creates another additional situation. And then Adriana went into a substitutive effect. You took away the participation of the federal government and you put the individual amendments into place. So you must understand that the answers to the survey, even though I agree with Master that this kind of thing is bad, but it reflects the exact moment we are in. Post-pandemic, the amendments are directed in a traditional manner towards the resolution of small local problems and a very serious issue for people who see themselves into it. Citizens oftentimes might not be satisfied with the amendments as they are. Now we have different problems. So this concern of delivering on assets for society, construction works. Well, basically, certain ministry is very agile in actually giving like a pamphlet, but not actually doing anything about it. So like the executive has its situations, the legislative also has its situations. So we don't have a general leadership today, neither in the executive or in the legislative. There's not someone who sits down with everyone and says, listen, we're not going to be competing about everything. It's not worth it, because we should now have criteria to who's going to get the rapporteur's amendments or not. So you can have internal means in Congress to evaluate this. Even better would be something together with executive power as well. And unfortunately, we don't have this figure of a leader. I'm going into budget. I mean, I'm just talking about budget aspects here. There's other aspects that we could talk about, but let's stick to the topic that we're debating here. It's obvious that the most current situation, which is the rapporteur's amendments, certainly they contributed to the result of the research, and they will contribute to any research you do, because today's agenda, the TCU started from the minister, took away this opportunity to buy these tractors from the legislators because they were overpriced. And so you can look at how confused this budget process is. They're going to hit the amendments, but they're going to affect the whole budget process as a whole. And when this happens, it doesn't matter what happens. You will always have a lack of alignment between those who are responsible to execute the policies and the Congress people, who will be just trying to protect themselves and give answers saying, I didn't do this, this doesn't work like that, that doesn't work like that. I didn't want to execute in this way. And then actually, in fact, you create a rupture between what had been actually proposed before. And not only is this legitimate after what happened in the endpoint, because we put this under a sign saying that the whole process is up in the air. So you end up really bringing problems to this project. Finally, trying to also go through those questions which you mentioned there. Well, I think it's very little likely that we are able to evolve and keep personal special transfers. We deviated completely to another side in order to facilitate certain transparency prerequisites, and the government evolved a lot with the Mais Brasil platform. Oftentimes we had the memory of all these prerequisites that you needed to go into one of these. So our democracy is supposedly robust. Can you imagine if we didn't have a robust democracy? Can you imagine if we just handed out money with no control? So this, for me, is a point that concerns me quite a bit, and it's like the dam is about to break. You have this crack on the dam, and you can't control it anymore. The dam will break. So we need to understand how to solve all this. As for me, I tend more and more to think that we need a new general constitutional pact. If we don't do that, I don't think we're going to come out on the other end with reforms. We're just walking forward on top of something that has a problem, a legal problem. I'm more and more convinced about this. Thank you, Thiago.
Yeah, definitely something has to change. We have a scenario of loss of credibility, and predictability is also important, and the importance to test models so that we can fit all these variables that influence in the capacity for for these funds to deliver goods and services to the society. From the control point of view, we are in our budget cycle. We have the accountability process, the accountability for consolidated accounts, and now we have a new model. And given the proportions, at TCU we could escape this trap of this temptation of looking at these resources in a pulverized way. In the 90s, we had thousands of accountability moments. The federal accountability. In the Ministry of Defense, there were hundreds of accountability, and it was reduced gradually. We had a different reasoning for that. And last year, we had a normative instruction to consolidate a new model to look at the ministries. And in the point of view of accountability, we had a focus on public accounts, looking at the ministries that are the largest ministries in terms of execution of budget. So we are in the process of account judgment, and some ministries, they execute 80%, 90% of the federal budget. So in that way, we could move the priority of the monitoring from the retail to a more systematized look on the capacity of the government to apply the resources. If you give 10 times more the resources that a certain entity is used to receive, there will be fraud and other problems. I think it is something that we need to pay attention to in the movement of the amendments. When you have a significant increase in the allocation of amendments without having a structure for that, bringing to a new reality, you see in the federal revenues large amount of dividing of the payments. So the institutions need to have this predictability and prepare for the use of the public funds. And sometimes we cannot provide this predictability and tackle the responsibility that the institution has, because with the resources that were provided to this institution and the responsibility. So when we don't have this balance, the institutions will try to protect themselves because there's a high risk. So it is an important point for us to have the notion of the risk, either a risk of conformity, integrity, and also the risk of the effectiveness. I mean, of not having effectiveness of the funds, not only in the political sphere, but for the specific politicians that will allocate certain amendments. Now let's listen to Julien talking about the problem of the coalition presidentialism. It seems to be collapsing, and the loss of credibility that we saw in the survey that we proposed to the audience. So most of the people have a very negative perception on the amendments. Well, it was predictable to see this result, and it's sad, of course, because it is a role of the Congress to determine the public expenses. I understand that we have structural problems, and they are structural in the sense that a Congress amendment will not solve the problem. If we see from 1988 until now, it's more than 30 amendments. I think we need to have a new national pact, a new national constitutional pact, and it has to be built, and then to have a new constitutional assembly, being careful for this to not repeat the same mistakes of the past. The organization of this assembly has to escape the trap that we were put in 1988. We cannot fix the Constitution in terms of budget, public budget. We have done all we could do, and everything has an expiring date. And in this aspect, I'm quite a pessimist person in terms when I look at the finance law. The specialists do not like to talk about it, but I don't know a constitution that determines the execution report. Only here in Brazil we have that. It is ridiculous, but it is there. And why is it there? Because if it's not there, the municipalities will not execute. So we need to build a new pact in what regards the budget. And in this matter, in my vision and in the vision of other economists, Jean Viazzi mentioned that we need to have a restriction rule. I don't know what it is, but we need to have one. And this rule must be accepted by all the stakeholders, and it has to be respected. It's not like building a rule and then in the first week of the existence of this rule, I will find a way to undo this rule. So I have a constitutional rule for a fiscal rule, and I promote 3 constitutional amendments to change it. So when we talk about rebuilding, it's rebuilding everything, even the role of the Federal Court of Accounts, maybe incorporating in the Constitution some things that the TCU has done in an important way, such as mitigating the interpretation problems. It has to do with the managers, of course, and other structural points that were mentioned. Volpe listed some things, and Marcio as well. There's no way to see the budget with 17,000 lines of programming. I went to England to see the English budget, and I asked them, what about the voting? And they didn't understand. They was laughing like, voting? What are you talking about? We vote in the parliament a certain amount, and the ministry will have the details. The parliament does not go into this level of detail. It's like, I'm going to recover 10 million pounds in roads. So the parliament votes for that, and the transport ministry or secretary will detail that. So I think that the traditional role of the parliament is to allocate the public policies. It's not like choosing this or that city or to have an amendment to recover a certain road in a certain place. It will not reach something, a determined thing. So I think the political system can be dysfunctional. So we can have a set of rules and say, fulfill it. But how can I fulfill it? And then I had dialogues with politicians regarding this. If they don't want to have an amendment to health, why do they propose the minimum amount for health? So nobody talks about that, because in the health care, they don't want to put money in that, but the executive should do that. So the discussion is not structured. You can make some fix here and there, but in my perception, throughout all these years that I worked in this area as an activist with a very close contact with the Congress, is that the system is deteriorated. It's not functional. And this lack of functionality generates these amendments of transferring our donation and many others. So I think that we need to try to understand the seriousness of the situation in which the country is, the point that we reached, and I know it's not easy. I will not see this done in my life, I think, but we need to plant the seeds. The constitutional pact in Brazil must be done with certain bases in which we can generate governability, stability for the president and other leaders, and to address the problems that we had since the 19th century. I don't even mention the 21st century, for us to take some steps, because the situation that we live in terms of income concentration and lack of infrastructure and all that, we will not be able to overcome this if we do not solve this Brazilian constitutional pact that I'm talking about, and Bruno also mentioned. And the main idea is came from José de Abrantes. So concerning the budget, we need to have restriction rules. It's not like it was in the past without any restrictions. So the parliament and the society need to understand that we need to have restrictions, and it has to be accepted. It's not like establishing a limit of debt, but people don't care about that. They will just run over it. So we need to have a conversation with all the stakeholders and build this. It is a big challenge. The debate itself is very interesting. I congratulate to see you for that. And it was good because there was not much repetition. We sort of complemented each other's ideas. We saw different aspects of a very complex reality. So basically, this is it. This is what I had to say. I'm sorry if I took too long in my talk, in my participation. No. Excellent, Juliano. You use your time appropriately. You are someone who knows the system, the budget system very well, and it's a great contribution. So we are a little over our time to finish this panel. As Juliano mentioned, it was an excellent panel, and by coincidence or luck, we had complementarity in the contributions of each of you, each one bringing us their own perspective, and it added a lot of value and helped us to see the problem and to see the opportunities in the discussion of Congress amendments. And of course, we cannot only talk about this topic. We need to have this post-pandemic reality that it's about to come, the challenges to the society, and how we can help the Congress people to tackle these demands coming from the society and equate that with the participation within the public budget. So Julian brought this example of the United Kingdom. I think it's a dream for us. It's very common in Europe and also in the US to see state ministers going to the Congress to show the accountability. For us, from the Court of Accounts, it is really the highest point of the budget cycle, to see the ministries showing where the resources were allocated and giving the accountability to of their responsibility. The way it is today, it's easy to move the responsibility to other people because the allocation is very much detailed. A lot of people deciding. There are different budgets within budgets. So every public agent, public congressperson has to understand that. And in the discussion of budget governance, it is key to become closer to the institutions that are dealing with the budget process. And the Court of Accounts and the Secretariat of Macro Evaluation and also the other units are involved in this budgetary cycle, in the sectorial units and in their cross-cutting evaluations. And I take the chance to not only to thank the presence of the panelists and the presence of the audience, but also to congratulate the team that is behind the organization of this budget week. The Secretariat, the Director of the Planning of Budget, Luciane Pereira, everyone who are in the Secretariat, in SEMAG, everyone in the Court of Accounts that is in the behind the scenes organizing this budget week. It is a historical event for us, and it came in a great moment. It's very timely when we have, in a moment that we have to develop solutions for complex problems, the chronic problems in our country. They involve economical, political, and social aspects, and they demand a lot of creativity, responsibility, and wisdom, and a lot of collaboration among all the stakeholders. And it is the best that we can do in an event such as this one, to get people closer to each other, to discuss the ideas, agreeing or disagreeing, having the opportunity to know what everyone thinks and find a consensus. The main challenge for the budget model is to be an instrument that will make it feasible to have a political consensus, so we can attack and we can tackle the difficulties that the population brought to their politicians in the elections. So it was a great moment to share with all of you. It was wonderful to listen to your perceptions, and the Court of Accounts is available to you in future moments. And I'd like to invite our audience to panel 4. We're going to have it tomorrow at 10 a.m. in the official channel, YouTube channel of TCU. We're going to talk about public policies, and it's a very modern topic, and it's part of the solutions of what we've been monitoring. it is necessary to evaluate, to assess the public policies, and to prioritize what is necessary in public budget. So these are my final remarks, and I'd like to wrap up this panel and thank you all and wish you a great day, a great rest of budget week to you all. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.